Well, welcome to episode 386 of 10-Minute Record Reviews, and this is a special episode, the third in my series of 5 under 20. And again, the idea of this series is to offer suggestions to collectors about picking up some undervalued jazz records from the classic period of 12-inch releases for not too much money. And before I get going, I'd just like to do a little sidebar on an ongoing video project. Some of you will recall that some time ago, I promised a video on Duke Ellington's pre-war compilations. And that project is still very much alive, but it's been slowed down by a couple of complications. I guess the first is there are a lot of Duke Ellington compilations, far more than I think I anticipated, even though I anticipated quite a few. Being compilations, they tend to be long. And Duke being Duke, there tend to be lots of different versions of the same song from relatively similar eras, so there is a lot of listening to do. And I guess the second complication is that I'm not trying to do in this video a Duke Ellington life history. That's available elsewhere, but it's rather hard to talk about these different compilations, which often tend to focus on particular eras, without getting into the various eras of his musical career and spending a little bit of time on that for context. Suffice it to say, I've gone right down the rabbit hole in this one, and I'd rather wait until I've got something coherent to say in terms of recommendations. So the Duke video is coming, but not right away. Now, back to the matter at hand, 5 records under $20. And a reminder that in this series, my goal is to suggest a number of classic jazz records for which an early pressing, not necessarily a first pressing, but an early pressing can be found for not too much money. And I've got 4 specific criteria. First of all, they have to be pressings which come from the first year or so of the original release. Secondly, there had to be at least 3 copies for sale on Discogs, which met my other main criterion, which is that those be for sale in very good plus condition for $20 US or less. So in other words, these are very good jazz records. They're very listenable. They're very collectible. They're not going to break the bank. And all of these are for my own collection. So all that said, let's get started. And the first record I'm going to talk about this time is this record by Barney Kessel on Contemporary Records from 1956. This is a mono first pressing. It's called To Swing or Not to Swing. Now, as a jazz guitarist, Barney Kessel is hardly unknown. He probably doesn't get the attention these days that a Wes Montgomery or a George Benson or even a Tal Farlow might get, but he was immensely popular amongst jazz listeners and jazz critics in the 1950s and the early 1960s. He was Downbeat's poll winner for, I think, 5 consecutive years from 56 through 1960. He was second for the preceding few years, and he was second again in, I think, 1961 or 1962. So for 10 years in a row, he's voted either the first or second best jazz guitarist by Downbeat readers. And this is all the more remarkable because he was based in California, and in his peak years, he recorded for Contemporary Records, which is not a nothing label, but it was a relatively puny label compared to the big powers like Blue Note and Prestige and so on who were recording in New York. He also had a substantial career as a session player in the 1960s. He played with the famous Wrecking Crew. He was part of the Wrecking Crew, that great group of session musicians in LA who were on so many different pop records all the way through that decade. He plays guitar on the Beach Boys' Wouldn't It Be Nice? He plays on Ike and Tina's River Deep, Mountain High. He plays on Sonny and Cher's I Got You, Babe. And this record, this one here, is just his second 12-inch record on Contemporary, and it's Kessel very much at the peak of his powers. It's also kind of a fascinating record because it has a diverse lineup in terms of musical styles. So you've got people who are very much associated with either cool jazz or hard bop from the 1950s, people like Bill Perkins on tenor sax, Red Mitchell, that great bassist, obviously on bass, and the great drummer Shelly Manne. But you've also got people, in particular, Harry Edison on trumpet, who are much more closely associated and really cut their teeth during the swing era in the 1930s and 1940s. And hence the name of the record, To Swing or Not to Swing, which is a nod to the linkages between the swing era and the modern jazz era, stylistically and rhythmically and so on, to the extent they exist. Also, it's a nod to the track listing, which has 4 very modern Barney Kessel originals pitted against 6 or 7 standards from the swing era. So it's a fascinating record. It's a fun record. It's still a bargain, particularly the first UK press, which I think comes out in 1957, but sounds just as good as the Contemporary pressing. So recommended, do pick it up. Now, the next record I have here is by the great jazz singer Anita O'Day. It's called Anita, although the actual title of the record is only printed on the inner label, and that is Anita O'Day Sings, but you can probably find it under either This is the first pressing on Verve, which was basically the label where she left her greatest legacy. And like Barney Kessel, Anita O'Day was a real fixture of the jazz scene in the 1950s. It doesn't necessarily get mentioned in the same breath as, say, Sarah Vaughan or Ella Fitzgerald these days. But she was kind of a big deal and really quite a quirky and very interesting singer. Her early career saw her spend much of the 1940s fronting big bands. That's basically what singers did between, well, really the 30s and the early 50s. They fronted large orchestras. Anita O'Day was really quite an independent-minded person, a bit of a wild woman at times. She marched to the beat of her own drum, that's for sure. She left home at age 15 to become a professional dance marathon winner. She then at age 16 becomes a chorus girl in Chicago, which cannot have been an easy life. She had, however, a very optimistic take on things, even when facing very difficult times. And that optimism probably explains why she married a drummer at age 18. By age 21, she was singing for Gene Krupa, which is where she begins her recording career. She also spent some time singing for Woody Herman and then much more extensively with Stan Kenton. She also sang for Basie in the late 1940s. She resisted efforts to pigeonhole her as a kind of a cutie pie, crinoline-clad, off-the-shoulder, peekaboo dress girl singer, which happened to a lot of female singers in the 1950s. She actually styled herself like a beatnik, which you can kind of see in this photograph there. She was also an avid consumer of illicit drugs. She did time for weed. She did time for heroin. Her career was interrupted a whole bunch of times by drug busts. And she remained, as far as I can tell, a fairly high-functioning heroin addict for the peak years of her career. And those peak years coincide with the years in which she was being recorded by Norman Granz, first for Norgran Records, and then from 1956 on by Verve. And this is her first ever record for Verve, and unless I'm wrong, I think it's actually the first ever official Verve Records release. As I mentioned, it's entitled Anita O'Day Sings. You can see this on the label printed there, and you also see the rather distinctive red and yellow color scheme, which was characteristic of the short-lived Verve Popular series, but again, one of the very first records, if not the first record, that Verve ever releases. Anyway, this record is full of bangers. Anita is at the top of her game. The secret to jazz singing, I often think, is personality, because really, what else would explain Sinatra's success? And that is her secret. She's completely engaging, or at least I think so. She's witty. She has remarkable flexibility. She can call up this wonderfully pure tone, but she can also have this rasp in her voice. She can call on that whenever she wants to. There's not much vibrato in her singing, but that adds a kind of conversational and intimate nature to her performance, which is something she shares with another favorite singer of mine, Astrid Gilberto. Anyway, you can't go wrong with much of Anita O'Day's output on Norgran or Verve in the 1950s, and this record is a great example. Now, the next record I'd like to bring to your attention, now this is actually a bit of a cheat, the Eddie Costa Quintet, and the original version of this is actually titled the Eddie Costa Quintet. And as I say, this one is a bit of a cheat because the first pressing on Mode dates from 1957, had a very small run, and it's not normally available for less than $20. I can say that for sure. However, the next two pressings by tiny labels, by Interlude in 1959 and by Premiere in 1962, are both excellent sounding releases and are available in quantity below the $20 threshold. And so here's a comparison of the three different covers. I have the Premiere release, which, as you can see, retains the original cover art, but because Art Farmer, by 1962, was a more famous musician than Eddie Costa, who actually died in the summer of 1962, Art Farmer gets billing here, and instead of being called the Eddie Costa Quintet, the record gets its own latter-day titling, and it's named after one of the tracks on the record. Eddie Costa is yet another of these tragic figures in jazz, but he's also one of those folks like Clifford Brown who packs an enormous amount of music and living into the short period of time he had. He played vibes and he also played piano, and he had very different styles on both of those. With the piano, he was really enamored of the lower range of the keyboard, less so with the vibes. In 1957, he was the only musician in the history of Downbeat's New Star category to win for two separate instruments in the same year. He appears on something like 100 records between 1954 and the year of his death, 1962, and he was a hugely sought-after sideman, as you could imagine, because he had this facility on two different instruments. This record has a fantastic lineup too. Costa is on piano and vibes, unsurprisingly. Farmer, of course, is on the trumpet. The great Phil Woods is on alto saxophone. Teddy Kotick is on bass, and Paul Motion, before he later comes to greater fame with first Bill Evans, and then later on with Keith Jarrett, is on the drums. So it's effectively an all-star lineup, even though people might not necessarily have appreciated that at the time of recording. And it's another one of those 1950s gems, really. It could have been a blue note under other circumstances, at least in terms of quality. Great lineup of tunes. The recording quality is excellent. Fidelity is excellent. And tunes are swinging and occasionally muscular, hard bop numbers for the most part. So you'll have no regrets at all picking this up. Now, the next record I want to talk about is this one by the Ray Bryant Trio called Little Susie. This comes out on Columbia, and this is a Canadian pressing from 1960, the year of release. I'll just show you, for those of you who are American or non-Canadian and don't often see the Columbia Canadian labels. They're 6i labels, just like the American one from the era, but they're kind of this nice, rich, deep purple. Anyway, so this is the Ray Bryant Trio's record, Little Susie. And on the cover, you'll see Ray with his daughter Susie, hence the name. So Ray Bryant, if you don't know him, was a hard-swinging piano player from Philadelphia, but not just a hard-swinging player. He also had a certain panache that he could apply when he felt like it. And stylistically, I guess you might put him right in the middle of a spectrum. So if you had Oscar Peterson at one end, with all his virtuosity and elegance, and at the other end, you had the gritty bluesiness of people like Bobby Timmons and Carl Perkins. He's basically in the middle of all that, and he could basically range to either end of the spectrum. He's one of those guys who got his break by being a house pianist in Chicago, as it happens, playing for traveling stars who came through on their own and needed a backing band. So he was effectively discovered at the same time, in 1955, both by Miles Davis and then shortly thereafter by Sonny Rollins. And he goes off to New York that year to record with both of them individually. And through the 1950s and 1960s, he records extensively with swing, bebop, and hard bop royalty all the way through those decades. His first two records as a leader, the Ray Bryant Trio on Epic and Piano, 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 Piano on Prestige, as well as his early solo work, those tend to be scarce and expensive in their original releases. But this one, his first release for Columbia in 1960, is still quite easy to find for not too many clams. I wouldn't call it a particularly challenging record. Bryant was, by and large, a stay-at-home pianist throughout his career, and there's no shame in that. In terms of the track listing, it's a mixture of his own blues compositions and a number of standards. So in that way, it's a very Petersonian kind of record. But as I mentioned before, what Bryant lacks in the sheer virtuosity and speed of a Peterson record, he makes up for in swinging harder than Peterson, in my humble opinion. And so I think it's well worth picking up. And speaking of Oscar Peterson, the last record I want to talk to you about today is a collaboration between the Oscar Peterson Trio, which in addition to Oscar Peterson, of course, includes Ed Thigpen on drums and the great Ray Brown on bass, and Milt Jackson, the great vibraphonist, who was one of the two great driving creative forces behind the modern jazz quartet. Now, this is one of my favorite Oscar Peterson records. If you watch this channel with any regularity, you'll know that while I consider Oscar Peterson rightly to be one of the great figures of jazz history, his playing is not normally something I gravitate to. My usual complaint about Peterson is that swing and spaciousness in his music are often sacrificed on the altar of dense, rapid virtuosity, and I would typically much prefer listening to Horace Silver or Vince Guaraldi or Bill Evans any day compared to Oscar, with all due respect. And as Oscar was the principal melodic instrument in a trio setting, which was how he spent most of his career, he could spend all of his time ripping up the keyboard to his heart's content. I don't begrudge anyone their affection for Oscar Peterson. I just don't find him as musical as some players, the way I don't find Eddie Van Halen as musical as a guitarist as J.J. Cale. However, here, Oscar is not in the trio format, and he's sharing space with a vibes player in Milt Jackson, who is renowned for swinging. It's interesting, too, that Jackson, for his part, would have chosen this collaboration because the principal tension in his main group, the MJQ, was between his own swinging, bluesy tendencies and the more formal, sometimes prissier inclinations of his creative partner, the pianist John Lewis. And so my point here is not to knock Lewis or to knock Peterson. It's simply to say that good records often result when gifted musicians, virtuoso musicians, have to edit their own style and their own excesses, arguably, in the interest of establishing a musical connection with a second musician whose gifts are complementary rather than similar. And on here, the synergy between Peterson and Jackson is palpable. Peterson is generous. Jackson pretty much ends up being the primary feature of the record, but Peterson's work outside of his own soloing results in some really excellent accompaniment, something you don't always get to hear him do. So once again, highly recommended. So there we are. That's 5 more records to look out for. And as ever, when searching for these titles, your results may vary, but they will hold cheap when I look for them. I promise you that. Thank you for watching. If you have other suggestions that are related to these, please do make them in the comments below, and I'll see you next time.